In 2012, it occurred in Guangdong, China. I was in my second year at that time. I didn't want to work part-time during my summer vacation, so I returned to my hometown. It was past 8 o'clock in the evening when I returned to the village in our small southern villages. The streets were usually less crowded than during the day, but that day there was no one. I was walking down the alley when I noticed a strange phenomenon. For a few days now, I'd noticed a circle of scattered paper dust in front of every house's door. These doors were closed, and this paper charm was probably to ward off the evil spirits. That was when I realized why there was no one on the street tonight. Someone had died in the village. Even though I didn't believe in superstitious things, I definitely still felt the hair on the back of my neck. So I didn't dare to stay in the street and dashed home shouting, "Dad! Mom! I'm back!" I exclaimed loudly. I went to school in Shanghai at the time, which was not far from home, but there was only one break per semester. So when they heard my voice, my parents greeted me cheerfully, and I noticed that my mother's face was very happy, while my father seemed a little concerned. My father approached me and pushed me into the house, refusing to let me speak. When I saw my father's worried expression, I felt strange. When my father pushed me into the house, he quickly shut the door and looked at me, terrified, as if there was something dangerous inside. When my mother noticed me asking, she explained why. It was discovered that there was a deceased person in the village and the death seemed strange. It was amusing to hear that my hometown was still superstitious about these things in this day and age. "Mom, we can't meddle in other people's domestic affairs, so don't believe these rumors," I explained. My father was irritated when he heard me say this because I didn't believe it. Then he came over and told me about Mrs. Lan's death. Miss Lan went to town a few days ago to buy food when a small truck behind her lost control and rushed towards her. Miss Lan was crushed by the wheel without having time to react. The entire car was smashed to the front. She died on the spot, and the scene was described as tragic. The most terrifying thing was not this, but Miss Lan's body, which could not close her eyes or close her mouth as if she was resentful. After that, when Miss Lan's family asked the monk to keep an eye on her, the monk stated that Miss Lan had died unexpectedly before the end of her life. As a result, Miss Lan's family sought someone to carry the coffin in accordance with the old custom. They carried the coffin for several days and nights and were still hanging around, which made my father very nervous and made him warn me not to go out at night. I agreed, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. My father truly understood me. He knew I always did my own thing and held at me. My mother was nagging next to me, and hearing her nags irritated me. So I told them I was tired and went to bed early so I wouldn't have to argue any longer. But that night, I had a strange dream, or rather, a nightmare. I had a dream that I was wandering through the village streets and alleys like a maze that I couldn't get out of. I ran into some friends on the street and went for a walk. Actually, even though we didn't get the full experience of a big city there, the beautiful scenery here was really nice. Especially the hill behind the village, because in recent years, people have paid a lot of attention to the ecological environment. The fresh air and the overlapping mountains was a good place. We kept playing like crazy until after 9 o'clock at night, when we split up and went to our respective houses. When I got home and saw that no one else was there, I remembered that my father had told me about Miss Lan's family carrying the coffin, but I didn't believe it and I was not afraid. However, as I entered the alley on the west side of the village, I was startled to hear a strange sound from behind. When I turned around, I saw 4 strange-dressed men approaching me, carrying a large coffin. They were all dressed in gray cloth with red ribbons. Only then did I realize I had encountered the coffin-carrying individuals sought by the Tran family. These people would greet everyone they met, but it was said that if the person responded, the pain of the deceased would be transferred to that person. They had most likely been carrying for a few nights and haven't been able to talk to anyone. They took charge as soon as they saw me. They greeted me enthusiastically, but I had lived here since I was a child, and I know the rule: don't answer or say anything. But that person's words continued to irritate me. My throat and eyes were itchy and I really wanted to respond. Also, my mind appeared to be in control at the time, and the answer was about to be said. At this point, a young man rushed from behind, holding an SLR camera, photographing people carrying coffins. I recognized the young man as a visitor from somewhere else, not knowing how he ended up in our village. He was extremely inquisitive about everything. The man was unaware of the carrying coffin rule, so he approached the people carrying the coffin. The coffin carriers rejoiced when they saw this person take the initiative to speak. I believed the young man was my age, and I was concerned that he would do something bad. But before I could say anything, I noticed 4 people carrying coffins turned their heads to look at me sullenly, as if they were afraid I would ruin the plan. Those people's stares gave me chills. I was terrified. I knew people who accepted this type of carrying coffin were bad people. I was shocked, so I kept my mouth shut. To avoid trouble, I could only turn my head and walk towards the house. The young man continued to inquire. Those who carry the coffin appeared to deliberately turn the coffin's head towards the young man while answering. That night I ran home, but my father scolded me so harshly that I didn't dare to tell him about what had happened that night, so I went to bed. When I woke up on Monday morning, my mind was dizzy and a little sore. I was not sure if it had anything to do with what happened the night before. I staggered out of my room to find my parents eating breakfast and discussing a car accident. I moved forward immediately and listened to my father's words. But after hearing it, I got a chill down my spine and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The dead man turned out to be the young man who came to our village last night with an SLR camera. He stayed in a small hotel in our village last night, but he only checked out and walked out in the morning. A large garbage truck passed him and then lost control. The garbage truck sped up and slammed into the young man. He died on the spot, under the wheel, without having the time to react. I felt a pang of fear and guilt as soon as I heard the news. If I had stopped him last night, he wouldn't have died. But if he hadn't died, I would have replaced him. What about me? There were no solutions to these problems, but there was a legend here, and those who answered the coffin driver will have a few years of bad luck. And in the worst case, death. Our village was in the remote mountainous region of the far northwest. Because parents worried about their children going out at night to meet wild animals, they often told scary stories to scare our children. This creepy story happened a long time ago. At that time, the tunnel was not open. Most of the villages were hunters and very few farmers. Because our village was isolated from the outside world, we had limited electricity at that time. The power source was only provided to the village committee. The poor families still had to use candles to light the night. In the evening, the whole village was pitch black. The space was empty and there was no one in sight. The children also soon returned home before the sun was out. In our village, there was a man named Tien. He was strong and good at hunting. It took him a long time to save money to buy a flashlight. That night, Tien woke up to go to the toilet. As soon as he stepped out of the room, he heard people talking outside the courtyard wall. He stood in the corner and listened carefully, but he only heard strange noises and didn't understand anything. Tien guessed that they were thieves, and they were using a secret signal. So he tiptoed open the courtyard door and looked outside to see if anything was amiss. Tien saw 5 black shadows in front of his neighbor Tam's door. This made him feel very strange. Because it was too dark, Tien could not see anything clearly, only feeling 5 shadows like 5 children playing. Tien thought that these children might be the children of the neighbors, and they sneaked out of the house in the middle of the night to make trouble. At this moment, Tien suddenly remembered that he had just bought a flashlight, and he quickly took it out to try. Tien went back to the house and took out the flashlight. Tien turned on the flashlight and shone it on Tam's door to see clearly. In an instant, Tien fell to the ground in fear. He was speechless. Tien saw 5 little monsters in front of Tam's house. They were holding an iron chain and spinning in a circle. That causes them to make noises when they walk. Tien's flashlight fell to the ground in an instant because he was too scared. The little monsters over there heard the noise, so they looked at each other. One of the little monsters seemed to be moving forward. The closer he looked, the scarier the hideous face of that little monster became. Tien looked at it and touched the iron chain in the monster's hand. Tien was so scared that he didn't dare to look at it again. His legs were shaking and he couldn't even get up. He saw the little monster getting closer and closer. He did not care about other things. He immediately knelt on the ground and bowed to the little monster. Tien begged the monsters to let go of his mercy. "If I do something shocking to you, please forgive me and spare my life," Tien said. But the monsters stood still, motionless. Tien could only slam his head harder, bowing to them repeatedly. While bowing, Tien heard footsteps getting further and further away. His sweat fell to the ground, but he still did not dare raise his head to look. Waiting until there was no sound, Tien dared to look up. Of course, there was not a single person around. Tien hurried back home and called his father, Lao Tzu. "Dad, I just met a monster." When Tien told his father about this matter, Lao Tzu, who was still sleeping, immediately became frightened. Lao Tzu quickly got out of bed and said to Tien, "Go to the yard to light incense and put 5 glasses of wine." Lao Tzu took Tien to the door, burned incense and poured wine. His father asked Tien to knock his head on the wine glass 5 times. Lao Tzu reminded him. Lao Tzu reminded Tien when anything happened he was not allowed to raise his head. After finishing his sentence, Lao Tzu ran back home quickly. Tien followed his father's instructions and bowed down to the cup. The voice getting closer and closer made Tien extremely scared. He felt like he was going to die. But he always kept his father's words in mind and didn't look up after he knocked his head 5 times. The voice was getting closer and closer to his ear. Tien closed his eyes tightly, afraid that Tien would be killed if he happened to see it. Then he heard a cup fall, and then there was no movement. Tien waited for a while, kneeling until his legs were a little numb. He slowly opened his eyes. On the ground, only the shards of 5 cups could be seen. He raised his head to look around. The flashlight that he had just dropped on the ground was still lit. The incense in the bowl had gone out. There seemed to be nothing to prove what he had just gone through, except for those fragments. Tien took the flashlight and returned to the house, his heart still pounding. As soon as he entered the door, his father sighed. "Looks like Tam from next door will not live long." Tien was surprised and asked his father what happened. Lao Tzu glanced at him and explained. "These are small ghosts sent by Hades who came here to lock the souls of the dying." According to what Lao Tzu said, Tien saw these things to be true to 80% of what he had seen. Tien was stunned because Tam was too young to die. He felt real fear. Since the monsters now drank and ate Tien's incense, they wouldn't kill Tien. Tien breathed a sigh of relief when he had just escaped death. Only the next day, when the sun began to rise, the countryside was still quiet. Tien was going up the mountain to hunt, suddenly remembering what his father had told him yesterday about Tam's short life. He unconsciously looked at Tam's house. At this moment, he saw the door of Tam's house open. Tam strongly took a gun and went out. Tien looked at Tam striding back, thinking that his father had lied to him about yesterday. Tien felt more comfortable seeing that Tam was very healthy. Then Tien continued to hunt without thinking about anything anymore. In the evening, Tien held 2 rabbits that he had hunted that day. From afar, he saw that there were many people gathered in front of Tam's house. He ran closer and saw that people were crowded around. Tien couldn't keep his composure and tried to squeeze into the crowd. He saw a white cloth hanging in Tam's yard, and Tam's body was covered with another white sheet in the middle of the yard. Tien was in a daze. Cold sweat poured out like a bath. At this moment, he felt someone pat him on the shoulder from behind. He was still shocked. Looking back, it was his father, Lao Tzu, with a stern face looking at Tien. Lao Tzu took his son home, and the whole way he didn't say anything but just sighed. Lao Tzu looked sadly at his son sitting on the bed and comforted him. Lao Tzu said that fortunately yesterday, the monster drank Tien's wine. Otherwise, Tien would also have a disaster. Since then, Tien did not dare to go out at night anymore. Later, other families in the village used this story to teach their children not to go out at night. When I was younger, my parents worked in big cities and did not return home all year, so I lived in a village with my grandmother and grandfather. They loved and spoiled me so much that I became obstinate. I often went out with 2 naughty boys who were in the same class as me at the time. Once they asked me to use our PE class to run into the forest and collect bird eggs. One of them climbed a tree in search of a bird's nest, while the rest of us waited below. After climbing the tree, he looked straight in one direction and kept staring. The other guy and I were waiting below, impatiently, so we urged them. "What are you doing for so long? We're getting impatient." He pointed to one direction and said, "I see someone hiding a treasure." Upon hearing this, the other boy and I ran up to another tree and climbed on it. I looked in the direction he indicated, and as expected, a woman burying a beautiful decorated box in a hole. The woman then covered the hole, knelt a few times to beg, and left. After the woman had gone, we went down from the trees to discuss what we were going to do. The boy in the green shirt proposed his idea, and the 3 of us agreed wholeheartedly. Because people in the village were unfamiliar with this type of burial, even cremation was uncommon. We had no idea what kind of box it was. That was all we could think of as we began digging up the box. The box was soon revealed. It was made of wood, carved with flowers all round and draped in a red cloth. The green shirt guy picked up the box and discovered it to be quite heavy. We were so excited that we ran all the way home with the box in our hands. My grandparents had to work all day, so the house was empty when the 3 of us entered. We were very excited to open the box and see what was inside. As soon as I opened the red cloth, I heard a shout from outside. It was our teacher's voice. The 3 of us were terrified and hastily hid the box under my bed. We climbed the backyard wall along the window, hoping to sneak out while the teacher knocked on the front door. As a result, when I poked my head out of the wall, I saw the PE teacher waiting for us beneath the wall. After being apprehended by the teacher, we were requested to invite our parents. I was chastised by my teacher all afternoon, and my grandfather picked me up at night. During dinner, I felt it was very cold in the house. After eating 2 small portions of rice, I got a headache and went to bed. That night I had a dream, or rather, a nightmare. A nightmare in which I was standing in the dark. A large house was not far away. I was so scared that all I wanted to do was get out of here as soon as possible. At this point, my friend who was in the green shirt walked right past me. With no soul eyes, he walked straight to the big house. I grabbed him and told him, "It's dangerous where you're going." But it didn't seem to work. He suddenly became very strong and shoved my hand away, and I couldn't imagine from where he got his strength. I followed him as he continued walking towards the house. As I approached, I noticed that there was no door and that the house was carved on all sides. He climbed on the carved flowers. He looked so horrifying, as if he was some kind of animal. He climbed to the top and then vanished. What the hell was going on? When I saw that, I dashed after him to catch up with him. When I got to the top, I looked down but couldn't see the bottom because it was pitch black. I looked down at the ground, feeling extremely insecure. Right at this moment, I felt like there was a hand behind me, pushing me. I screamed in terror as I fell completely into the abyss. I screamed and sat up only to realize that everything had been a nightmare. I was sweating profusely, feeling cold and dizzy. It was nearly 4 a.m. and it was still dark. I couldn't sleep any longer, so I hugged my pillow and knocked on my grandparents' room door. When my grandparents discovered that I had a fever, they gave me fever-reducing medicine and wrapped me in a blanket. I quickly fell asleep as a result of the drug's effect. I opened my eyes in a dream and saw that large house not far away. I was afraid, so I tried to turn around and run. As I was running, a figure darted past me like the wind. I took a closer look, and it was the boy in the green shirt, and I was not sure what he was doing here again. Then, as soon as I turned my head, the wall with the carvings appeared in front of me. The boy in the green shirt began climbing unconsciously as if he were being controlled like the last time. I looked up higher and there was a figure crawling on the wall. It was the other guy who had been waiting with me under the tree. I gritted my teeth and climbed up, even though I had no idea what I was doing. Just like the last time, there was an abyss on the other side of the wall, and I was not sure who pushed me down. But this time was different. I didn't regain consciousness and quickly collapsed. I smelled burning straw and looked around. The front and back were both dark, and the walls were grey. Not far away, I noticed 2 figures lying on the ground. They were my 2 friends. I quickly crawled to the green shirt guy and flipped him over. There was no facial contour on his face, only a large mass of flesh protruding in the middle with a large slit. I immediately broke out in a cold sweat, wondering what the hell this was. The large slit suddenly opened, revealing a massive eye. I was terrified. How did he become that way? I didn't dare to look at him, so I quickly turned my head, only to discover that the surrounding walls were all covered in big and small red eyes. And where I fell, now on the ceiling, were round eyes, each one staring at me fiercely. I rolled my eyes and fainted because everything happened all of a sudden. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the hospital with my grandparents looking at me with concern. But I didn't have the strength to ask for help. My throat was dry and I couldn't speak. I fell asleep again and couldn't wake up after a few seconds. This time when I opened my eyes, I was in the place full of eyes and my 2 friends had vanished. I was shivering in fear and losing my mind when I smelled the scent. I followed it and saw an open door. I crawled and rolled towards the door as if pleading for something. From behind, I heard a crackling sound and the floor became extremely hot. I didn't dare to look back. Instead, closing my eyes and running straight towards the door in a state of panic. I finally woke up when I stepped outside. I opened my eyes to find myself back at home lying in bed. The house was filled with incense smoke, and an old man dressed as a shaman was holding a bunch of incense around me while reading something. After I recovered from my illness, my grandfather informed me that the box my friend and I dug up was a forbidden item belonging to someone else. My grandfather knew something was wrong when he took me to the hospital for treatment, so he invited the village shaman to come and see. He noticed something filthy in the house right away and discovered the box under the bed. After asking my 2 friends for directions to the location where we dug the treasure up, The shaman and my grandmother and grandfather buried the box once more and begged forgiveness. I was finally awake and healthy after the shaman blessed my house all day long. I'd become more obedient since then, because every time I wanted to be naughty, I imagined those eyes staring at me in that very nightmare. This story took place in a rural area in China in the late 1990s. Tang was a famous carpenter in the village who was highly skilled. Many other carpenters followed Tang to apprentice level. Early this morning, someone came to the house to ask Tang to build a new house for him. This guest was Old Wang, an influential person in the village. Lao Wang had been a contractor for a vegetable market in the western village for several years, so he had earned a lot of money. After discussing the cost that Mr. Wang offered was quite stingy, but he was still not satisfied. This older man was a famous bully, domineering, notorious, and dishonest. Because they were from the same village, Tang was reluctant to accept a job with a relatively low salary to please the old Wang. Because Lao Wang's construction schedule was quite urgent, Tang quickly gathered all the staff to start working immediately without delay. With a large staff, the whole team got to work very quickly and easily in the first 3 days alone. The building's wall was already more than half a person's height. The work was still going well, but the people working for Lao Wang were a bit unhappy. According to local custom, when teams of carpenters and masons worked for the owner, the host family would be in charge of tea, water, cigarettes, and lunch. Tea and cigarettes didn't have to be delicious, but they were always enough. Lunch must have meat, vegetables for everyone to eat full to have the strength for work. Lao Wang was a rich man, so the team thought they would be treated more thoughtfully than many other families. Unexpectedly, a few days later, the team did not have a cigarette, a sip of water, let alone a hearty lunch as imagined. Most of the meals were vegetable dishes that were not very fresh. This thing must be rotten vegetables left over from Tang's vegetable market the other day. Much older staff were often unwell. Staff complained to Tang that Lao Wang did not treat people like humans, but Tang knew he couldn't do anything either. He could only try to comfort everyone to continue work. After all, his life was not as good as other people's. But everyone did heavy physical work. Continuously fasting for many days made it difficult for them. Those people's jobs began to slow down obviously. Tang's face was also a little unstable. In his heart, he also understood everyone's grievances, just pretending to be confused to avoid it. "Okay, tomorrow I will go see Lao Wang," Tang said. The next day, everyone gathered at the main house to prepare to install the beamed roof. According to the old local custom, on this day, the family would prepare 8 dishes, 8 bowls, and a table for the crew. Next to it would be a red envelope for the captain. Unexpectedly, as soon as Tang finished speaking, Lao Wang's face changed color. "What? I have to pay wages and have to invite you to the party? Who do you think you are?" As soon as Tang heard Lao Wang's words, his anger rose. He immediately uttered all the words he had suppressed for the past few days. "This is the rule. Everyone does it. Why would you have to ask that?" As soon as everyone saw the dispute, they all stood behind Tang. They also began to speak angry words about what had happened. Lao Wang was used to being domineering in the village. How could he give in? He took out his phone and started calling someone. After that, a few thugs were present to settle the dispute. They used to follow Lao Wang to help him underwrite the vegetable market. Those thugs weren't from this village, so they had nothing to fear. They immediately ran to Tang and shouted, "Are you planning a riot?" Before Tang could speak, he was hit in the head with an iron rod by the thug. The blood spurted out a lot. Tang was seriously injured. The other bricklayers, seeing this, did not dare to say anything. Now, Lao Wang's arrogance was shown many times more than before. But how could Tang swallow this humiliation? Before, he was respected all his life by people. Everyone rushed to take Tang to a small clinic in the village to bandage and sew up the wound. Fortunately, his injury was not serious. When it was almost noon, everyone sighed in anger and went back to work because they knew Lao Wang's human nature wouldn't pay them the rest if they quit. When the work was almost done, Tang returned. He used a ladder to climb the roof. Seeing that everyone who looked at him wanted to help him, but Tang refused everyone's help because he was planning on his own. There was no need to discuss Tang's level. With just a few moves up and down with 2 hammers, soon the entire roof beam frame was completed by Tang. 2 days later, all the tiles were covered on the roof. Finally, Lao Wang's 4 magnificent large tiled houses were built. People in the village could not help but whisper about the largest house in this region. 1 month later, the house was completed. The villagers gathered together again, but there was a new theme about Lao Wang's house. After moving to a new home, Wang's mother, who was still recovering, suddenly died of a serious illness. Because Lao Wang and his mother used to have a bad reputation in the village before, no one cared when his mother died. As for Lao Wang, since he moved into the house, fires had occurred continuously. The mother died. The wife divorced. His daughter was about to be married off to the town's mayor to strengthen their relationship. Suddenly, the husband's family changed their minds. A few days ago, someone reported that Lao Wang was arrested at the market. Several times when the police came to the market gate, the whole vegetable market was scared and no one dared to intervene. The brothers who followed Lao Wang all left one by one. A few days later, Lao Wang was seen going to restaurants serving food in the city to ask for money. Maybe there were so many unhappy things during this time that his mind lost focus for a while. When Lao Wang was crossing the street, he was suddenly crushed by a speeding car. No one expected that a famous person like Lao Wang would die so tragically. After Lao Wang's death, his family suddenly became poor. At this time, Lao Wang's wife said that the assets in their family all belonged to her. She had only written for divorce with Lao Wang but had not yet gone to the city to apply for a certificate. His wife sold the newly built house to a businessman from the city. After she took the money and left, never to return. The new owner in that city wanted to build a small second floor, so he sent workers to demolish the roof. But when the worker lifted the tiled roof, he was stunned. Although this worker had worked in the construction industry for many years, he had never seen such an incident. On the main beam of the house, there were 7 large iron nails with strange shapes that were nailed side by side. For a moment, no one dared to move. Everyone felt that something was wrong. After observing it for a long time, an old worker saw a clue. He said it was witchcraft in the carpentry profession, nailing the family feud with a coffin. With this spell, everyone in the house would die. The house was eventually demolished and rebuilt as a 2-story building from which nothing happened. Because of this incident, people did not dare to ask Tang to work anymore. This horror story happened 7 years ago near Xingxing Farm, China. This experience was considered a memorable one. That year, I was heartbroken because my girlfriend of 2 years left me. I signed up for a 4-day tour in Guangxi province with a group of guests. Most of the people in the group were older men and women, and I was the only young man. After we walked around on the beach, the guide continued to take us to a farm on a large mountain to see the forest landscape. To me, it didn't matter where I went, as long as I left the city where I lived to forget about my story of heartache. Because of the city being so small, almost every corner had memories of my ex-lover and myself. After visiting the beautiful natural scenery of the farm, we were arranged to rest in a renovated hotel from the villa. The condition of this villa was good. It had an observatory outside. The scenery in the distance was beautiful. Thanks to that, my mood gradually improved. Actually, now that I thought about it, I felt stupid. I realized that in this world not everyone could walk together for a lifetime when in love. Maybe this was my first love, so it took me a long time to forget. On the farm, it got dark very quickly because it was surrounded by forest. It was especially quiet. The elders who accompanied us took an early break. There would be no excursions in this forest in the evening, so I slept early that night. I remember that I slept until midnight. After 11 o'clock, a humming sound suddenly woke me up. After being woken up, I couldn't go back to sleep. Once again, a particularly shrill sound resounded in the stillness of the night. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to get up and go outside to look for that sound. I wanted to see who did what to disturb people sleeping in the middle of the night. Following the sound that was coming from, I went to the back of the villa and saw that no one was there. In the backyard, there was only a large stone mill. I saw that no one else was there. I raised my ear to hear it, and the sound seemed to come from this mill. At that time, I found it a bit strange. This mill weighed several tons and seemed to have been thrown straight to the ground. How could there be a sound if no one moved? However, after I got close, I discovered a strange phenomenon. This large mill seemed to be covered with charms, although the rain and wind made them slightly fade the color. My house was also in the countryside, so I was not unfamiliar with this, but I had never seen such a peculiar stone mill. I could be sure the sound was coming from below the millstone. I kept putting my ear to the mill and listened. This sound was so shrill, like someone below was bumping into a big stone mill. This thing scared me. Was anyone here? Or was there a secret below? I thought. My curiosity also surfaced. I saw a cork on top of that large stone mill and knew that this was a screw hole. I didn't know what I was thinking at the time. I didn't hesitate at all to approach and unscrew the cork. As soon as the cork was pulled out, there was an explosion, and some cold air appeared. It seemed that the bottom was isolated from the outside world. How could the creature below survive? Humans or animals couldn't survive below this without air, so what exactly hit the rock underneath? How did that thing get down there? I put my eyes into the hole and peered under the stone to check. Sure enough, the bottom of the stone mill was empty, like a deep dark well that was hard to see. But after observing for a while, my eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness. When I saw everything in the well, I couldn't help but be startled. Under the well, there were dozens of human skulls. They thickly piled up. I didn't know how old these human skulls were. The black eye sockets of those skulls seemed to be looking at me, looking very scary. I felt that those skeletons had turned into resentful spirits. They were rushing towards the mouth of the well where I was looking down. This thing scared me. I quickly backed away and my eyes left the hole. However, at that moment I saw a dark cloud rush out of the mouth of the hole. The dark cloud hit me right in the eye, and I immediately felt a sting, a very uncomfortable feeling. After stinging my eyes, I felt dizzy. I tried to scratch my head and pull my hair. That feeling made me nauseous for a while. The world was spinning, my eyes were dark. At that time, I only had one thought, that was to return to my room quickly. But then my mind suddenly lost control and my body could not move anymore. There were many people talking in my ears, but I couldn't understand a word. Before I fell, two figures appeared in front of me. They asked me, "Why are you here at this hour?" They seemed to be talking about my situation and how to save me. I didn't remember anything anymore. "Looks like he did it," said one. While unconscious, I had a strange dream in my dream. I saw a group of Japanese soldiers walking into a small mountain village with guns in their hand. There were a few people dressed as villagers, hiding in the shadows and attacking the Japanese with stones and bricks. They used familiar terrain to attack quite effectively. Soon the Japanese soldiers had their heads smashed. The remaining Japanese soldiers panicked for a moment. Their formation became more chaotic. The Japanese soldiers were killed by unexpected stones thrown by the villagers. When the villagers hiding in the shadows ran out and killed the Japanese soldiers, they piled up Japanese soldiers' bodies. They cut off the heads of those Japanese soldiers. Their heads were covered in blood and looked terrible. The villagers threw the soldiers' heads into a dry well. The dry well in my dream was very similar to the deep well under the stone mill that I saw tonight. The heads fell and gradually disappeared into the deep darkness. I don't know how these images that only appeared in anti-Japanese dramas appeared in my dreams, but then I dreamt of the big stone mill. The whole of the great mill was constantly releasing black gas, and there were wailing voices. Finally, the wailing sound disappeared, but it became the thumping sound I heard tonight. The great mill was also full of curses. Everything was slowly becoming blurry. There were really souls in that deep well. After that, my consciousness seemed to have recovered a bit. Those strange dreams disappeared. I could hear people moving around, but my eyes couldn't open. I felt someone cut a small cut on my forehead with a sharp knife. Then the man burned a paper talisman over my head, and he put the paper talisman in a jar. I also didn't understand what this meant. Then, like a steamer, he pressed it to cut my forehead. I could almost feel my blood being sucked into the vacuum cup. I could be sure that my feeling was right at the time. But during the whole process, I couldn't keep my eyes open even though I wanted to. When I was fully awake, the sky was clear. I jumped out of bed and the story last night seemed to have never happened. But there was a sharp pain in my forehead. This wound reminded me that everything last night was not a dream. I covered my forehead and went to the villa owner to ask him what had happened. But from them I got a completely different answer from what I felt. The answer seemed reasonable, but I really couldn't accept it. I didn't know if I was thinking about that. I always felt that the villa owner was reluctant to tell the truth. I turned and ran into the yard, wanting to see the big mill from last night. But when I saw it, I was stunned. A large glass plate was placed around the stone mill. Looks like it was just brought in there, so it looked brand new. The cork that I remembered was pulled out last night was now pressed again. 2 new talisman symbols crossed across the cork. If everything went according to what the boss said, how could all of this be explained? After that, I went to ask the owner of the villa again. They said the stone mill was a cultural relic, and the paper talisman was used by villagers for blessings, not for exorcism. I knew I would be powerless because I had nothing to prove, so I stopped arguing with them. And when I went through that night, I didn't know what to say now. And as I experienced this night, I was left speechless. It occurred in 2015 at a vocational high school in Nagakawa, Japan. That year, I graduated from middle school but failed to enter high school, so I enrolled in this vocational technical school to learn how to repair machines. Our school had just built a new and very spacious facility, and the 3 of us lived together in a dormitory. The bond between the 3 of us was strong. On a weekend I played poker with a friend in the dorm, but if there were only 2 players it was a little sad, so we were going to invite the other guy, Yoshi, to join us. However, because Yoshi was not in the dorm, we didn't have much fun playing most of the time. Yoshi was in fact very different from the rest of us. He had been accepted to a prestigious high school that year, but he chose this one instead. We noticed him staring at his phone that day with a blank face, so we crept up behind him. We all assumed Yoshi was in love, secretly chatting or watching a 18+ movie at the time. But as we got closer, we noticed that he was staring at a photo on his phone and still had tears in his eyes. It was a picture of him with a short middle-aged man. It seemed to be his father. The two of them were standing beneath a stone wall and their smiles were especially warm in the photograph. We were surprised to see the situation, but we both assumed he was homesick. "Do you miss home?" the other friend inquired. I mocked him a few sentences, not with malice, just to make him feel better. "How old are you? Still crying?" But Yoshi still didn't say anything, and when he did, we were both taken aback. "Today is the first death anniversary of my father." We recognized that teasing Yoshi was a mistake. Fortunately, Yoshi was not the type of person who was difficult to get along with, nor did he blame us. Rather, he freely told us his story. We also learned more about his father from the story Yoshi was about to tell. Yoshi's hometown was located in the mountainous region of Gifu province. Despite living in a poor rural area, Yoshi's family life was very good because his father had a unique profession. In addition to farm work, his father went to the mountains to collect medical herbs, and the most difficult part was that he had to climb the sharp cliffs by tying a rope around his waist. Of course, this was extremely dangerous, and the mountains there were high and steep, and there were cliffs at the mountain's base. If you had fallen, you would certainly die. But taking these risks was worthwhile for Yoshi's father because the celandine, a valuable medicinal herb, grew on the rock ledge. The celandine was unknown to many people before, but in recent years, it had suddenly become extremely valuable because it could cure some rare diseases at the time, and its price was rising. And because Yoshi's father risked his life to climb the cliffs, every time he could pick the celandine, he would earn a large sum of money. As a result, the entire family's life was improved. He was very satisfied despite the fact that it was difficult and dangerous. However, he was very frugal, only using an old rope to climb up and down, which frequently worried Yoshi's mother because the old rope would be unstable. A year ago, the rope wrapped around the cliff and broke while he was taking medicines from the cliff. When the rope snapped, he lost the protection and fell off the cliff. Everything happened so quickly, he didn't have time to grasp anything. In fact, their family was very concerned about this herb picking job. The family has warned him numerous times not to continue because it was extremely dangerous. But he always laughed and encouraged Yoshi to work hard at school. It would cost money to get into university later, so he wouldn't do it until Yoshi graduated. Yoshi's tears welled up again as he said this time, the first time we saw a child blaming himself for being so good at studying. I turned around and ran outside after hearing Yoshi's story and seeing how sad he was remembering his father. Many people considered that I was a smart boy. Everyone knew that I always did things on purpose but could never guess what I was going to do next. After 4 or 5 minutes, I ran in from the outside, lit 3 cigarettes stolen from the house next door. Yoshi's tears were flowing again at this point. He was very emotional. Honestly, I was not sure if this was appropriate, but it was a tribute to Yoshi's father. We lit 3 cigarettes and placed them on the windowsill, bowing 3 times simultaneously. After all of this, we were well-connected friends. We had a good time again. In this way, even after the cigarette had been extinguished, the father and son's emotions were always kept in their hearts. But when we went to bed that night, we experienced something very strange. We all slept soundly that night, but in the middle of the night, I awoke, feeling extremely cold for no apparent reason. I awoke but couldn't move. I could only open my eyes. At this point, I noticed a person standing in front of Yoshi's bed, a vague black shadow whose face couldn't be seen clearly. But I had a strong feeling that the person was his deceased father. The man sat on Yoshi's bed, smoking a cigarette and still talking to him in his mouth. His voice was so deep that I could only faintly hear it. He admitted it was his fault and advised Yoshi to take good care of himself, his mother, and to do well in school when he grew up. Yoshi was crying all the time, but he didn't wake up. Perhaps he was having a very sad dream. Yoshi's father remained bedside, talking to him. Then I fell asleep, and when I woke, it was already dawn. Yoshi's eyes were very red after waking up, and the dark circles under his eyes were also very visible, possibly due to his dream last night, in which he cried all night. I asked him if he had a nightmare the night before, because I saw Yoshi cry a lot. I quickly remembered last night's incident and told Yoshi. Yoshi stated that he had a dream about his father last night in which he was smoking next to his bed. When he finished, the other boy couldn't help but be surprised. There truly had been a conversation between Yoshi and his father, and I was an eyewitness to it. That guy suddenly shouted, "Look! There are actually some cigarette butts at the foot of Yoshi's bed!" We had to know that none of the 3 people in our dorm could smoke, and a strange feeling came over us. I couldn't help but recall the person I saw last night in Yoshi's dream, in which Yoshi's father sat in this position and smoked. Yoshi's tears flowed again as he sat on the bed, reaching out his hand to touch where his father had sat, as if the warmth that his father had left behind remained. "Don't worry, Dad. When I grow up, I'll take care of myself and Mother. I'll be a strong man." This was a sacred event that I witnessed firsthand, and to be honest, I was not afraid. In my heart, I only had a warm feeling about Yoshi's father-son relationship. We all graduated. Yoshi was introduced to work by the school, and the salary was also good. I believed his father was also relieved. An internal basketball game was held at the company. Lou, as one of the few accounting department representatives, was compelled to take part in this game. Because the game was so intense, it was difficult to avoid unnecessary injuries. During the confrontation phase, Lou was hit hard by the opponent and lost his balance. When he fell on the ground, he was unable to stand and sprained his ankle. Lou couldn't get up at the time and had to be helped by everyone around him. He went to the hospital to have it checked out. The ankle was slightly deviated, and while it was not a serious injury, being hospitalized was unavoidable. Hospitalization was tedious. Lou did not have a girlfriend, so only a few close friends paid him a visit. He had to kill time the rest of the day by playing on his phone or watching TV. Lou wanted to go to the bathroom right after dinner that night, but walking was now extremely difficult. While walking down the hallway, Lou ran into head nurse May, who knew Lou was going to the bathroom. The nurse informed him that the water pipe in the toilet on the 5th floor was broken and in need of repair, and he was directed to another floor. As a result, Lou had to take the elevator down to the 4th floor to use the restroom. Lou looked around and noticed that there were no lights here. It looked like this was the first floor where an experimental device was placed. Lou looked around and noticed an area with what appeared to be a toilet that could be used. Lou rushed through the bathroom and was washing his hands in the sink. In the mirror, Lou noticed someone passing by. Although it was impossible to tell who it was, it looked like an elderly man. Lou was unconcerned about this. After washing his hands, he turned to another corner of the corridor and pulled out a cigarette to smoke. Because smoking was not permitted in the room, so he would smoke 1 cigarette every time he was going to the toilet. Lou unintentionally looked towards the end of the corridor while taking a breath. He smirked slightly and felt strange. The old man hadn't left the floor yet. He was standing in the corridor's corner, turning his back on him. Judging by the old man's appearance, he would have encountered a difficult situation, so he came here alone to vent his rage. During his hospital stay, he heard many heartfelt stories from patients and their families. When he finished smoking, he extinguished the cigarette butt and quietly exited the room. He went to the elevator area to return to the 5th floor, but he was surprised when the elevator door was about to close. The old man he had just met on the other side of the corridor while smoking refused to leave and remained in this corner of the corridor in the same posture. Lou approached the old man. He didn't want to be intrusive, but today he wouldn't be silent. Lou handed the old man a cigarette and said, "Old man, whatever you're up to, let's start with a cigarette, right?" The old man ignored Lou and refused to budge. Lou couldn't understand, so he moved closer and only saw the old man mumbling something. After a long period of listening, he heard what sounded like a string of numbers, 9917. Lou was perplexed, so he shifted his position to the old man's side, intending to ask him what the numbers meant. But when he got to the old man's side, he discovered that the old man had a problem. He didn't appear to have a left hand. His left sleeve was bare. Lou immediately detected a strong odor of blood. When Lou looked again, there were no feet under the old man's trousers leg, and blood was oozing out from there. And his mouth continued to mutter the previous numbers. His face muscles twisted. He looked so angry. Lou was scared of crutches and turned away when he saw him like that. He staggered into the elevator. Thankfully, the old man did not pursue Lou. He was still standing at the same place. When Lou returned to the 5th floor, he felt like a lost soul, devoid of emotion. Lou ran into Nurse May again, who was standing in front of him puzzled. The nurse was wondering why he looked so strange, so she asked him if he was in any pain. Lou wanted to speak at first, but he hesitated and then found an excuse to give a vague answer before returning to his room. He believed that what occurred was insignificant and that he should simply return to his room, get a good night's sleep and forget about it all. However, Lou thought it was too simple when in the middle of the night he was woken up by the voice of someone reading the familiar numbers. The sound came from behind him, sending shivers down his spine. He sat up abruptly despite the fact that the room was dark, but the contours of his face made Lou see who it was. The old man's face remained the same as before, angry, with his teeth grinding and his mouth constantly repeating the numbers. Lou screamed and tried to flee instinctively, but due to the pain in his leg, he lost control and fell on the ground. When he collapsed, the lights in the room turned on, indicating that this was not a dream. Nurse May's voice came from the door. Perhaps Lou's scream drew the attention of Nurse May, who dashed over to investigate. Lou couldn't believe what he had just witnessed, but when he got up, he noticed that the old man by the bed had vanished. May was extremely concerned after witnessing Lou's unusual actions. The nurse rushed to help Lou up. She suspected he had fallen because his leg was hurting. Lou inquired of Nurse May about the presence of an elderly man in the room. Surprisingly, May stated that there was no one else in the room. Lou claimed that an old man was standing beside his bed just now. Nurse May noticed Lou's panic and attempted to calm him down. Nurse May's reaction surprised him. Did he really see it incorrectly? Suddenly, he remembered the strange number sequence he had heard. He inquired of Nurse May as to whether she was familiar with the sequence. He claimed that the old man he met only repeated these numbers over and over, as if he was trying to communicate with him. Nurse May believed he was stressed and advised him to get more rest, but she still jotted down the figures before leaving. Unable to sleep and fearful of turning off the lights, he remained awake in the hospital room until the morning. The next day at noon, Nurse May arrived and informed them that she had investigated the strange number. It was, in fact, the patient number. It was the code of an elderly man who died in a hospital many years ago from a serious illness and was once in his patient room. She comforted him with a smile. Such things happened all the time in hospitals. It was not uncommon. It turned out that Nurse May, like Lou, had the same experiences when she first started working at the hospital. But the more she got used to it, the less these spirits would harm her, just make her a bit nervous. Some people could sense spirits, while others couldn't. However, anyone encountering this for the first time would be equally terrified. Lou was discharged half a month later, and when he walked out of the hospital, he felt much better. It was just terrifying encounters like these that everyone would have while staying at the hospital.